Welcome to our Introduction to Environmental Management according to ISO 14001. Many companies and organizations are aware that in the public perception the topic, environmental protection, has a high priority. With the introduction of an environmental management system according to ISO 14001, the framework conditions are created to contribute to the protection of the environment, to minimize their own negative environmental impact and to raise awareness among employees, customers, suppliers and other partners. In this video you will learn the following. First, what is ISO 14001? Second, what are the objectives of an environmental management system according to ISO 14001? And third, what are the essential requirements of the standard and how can they be implemented? ISO 14001 is an international standard for environmental management systems. ISO is the international standards organization of which all national standards institutes are members. The National Standards Institute in the United States is the American National Standards Institute, which publishes the ANSI standards. Differently to European Standards Institutes, the American National Standards Institute does not issue its own version of the ISO 14001. ISO 14001 now specifies minimum requirements that an organization or company must meet in order to comply with this standard. If a company wishes to document to the outside world that it meets all the requirements for an environmental management system, it can have itself certified by an accredited certification body after introducing and implementing the system. The main objectives associated with the implementation of an environmental management system are: protection of the environment. This includes avoiding or reducing harmful environmental impacts. In practice, this can mean that a company changes its production processes so that they emit fewer harmful emissions into the environment. However, it is not only production processes that should be considered, but in general all processes of a company and its products in all phases of the life cycle. Therefore, not only the processes in the company are to be considered, but also the upstream and downstream processes. This begins with the extraction of raw materials needed for input materials and ends with environmentally compatible recycling or disposal at the end of a product's life cycle. But environmental management systems should also create a financial benefit for the company. Material and energy savings can also reduce costs. By positioning itself as an environmentally friendly company in the marketplace, additional sales can perhaps be made. Finally, the environmental management system should also serve to communicate the company's own environmental performance to interested parties. Interested parties in the sense of the standard are all stakeholders who may have an interest in the company. These are primarily owners, employees, customers and suppliers. But also neighbors, the public or legislators. Like most management system standards, ISO 14001 is divided into 10 chapters. The requirements relevant for certification start in Chapter 4, Context of the Organization. The standard defines context as the company itself and the external environment of the company. The requirement in the environmental management system is now to understand this context and what significance it has for the company. The following external topics could be relevant for the company: legal and political framework, availability of energy sources, means of transportation and other infrastructure. Financial resources, competitive market situation, secure supply chains, social and cultural aspects, available technologies. Environmental issues, such as global warming, melting of glaciers, higher frequency of storms, are also the subject of a context analysis. Internal issues relate to corporate culture, employee management, information management and knowledge sharing, relationships among employees, capacities and infrastructure in the company, decision-making processes and the like. All these issues are to be evaluated in the context of environmental management, what influence they have on the company and how they affect the company's environmental performance. In a next step, the requirements and expectations of interested parties are collected. Interested parties are, for example, employees, the owner, customers, suppliers, neighbors, non-governmental organizations, for example environmental organizations, banks or legislators. All these interested parties have a direct or indirect influence on the company. Firstly, it must be determined what the respective requirements and expectations are, to what extent they can be fulfilled, and what the effects of non-fulfillment would be. Certain requirements must be met, for example legal requirements or contractual requirements, as soon as the contract has been signed. Requirements from groups with indirect influence, for example environmental protection organizations, do not have to be met, but there is the question of the damage caused by not meeting them. For example, the company's reputation could suffer as a result. Finally, Chapter 4 contains requirements for the environmental management system itself. The scope of the system must be defined, for example, which locations of a company are included in the system. ISO 14001 also requires management to implement and continuously improve the environmental management system, as well as documenting processes, responsibilities, environmental goals and measures for achieving these goals. The standard often refers to documented information. The standard understands this to mean information that is managed and maintained. This can be in electronic form, for example in the form of a text file, but it can also be in paper. For certain information, ISO 14001 now specifies that it must be available as documented information. Therefore, after explaining the contents of a chapter, we will always summarize which documented information is required by the standard and which other documents are useful as evidence in an audit. Even if the standard does not require any documented information for a requirement, it must be possible for the auditor to trace in some form how this requirement was fulfilled during certification. The documented information required by the standard in Chapter 4 is: first, the scope. The scope of the environmental management system must be defined. Usually this is done in an environmental management manual or as part of the environmental policy. The results of the context analysis and the expectations and requirements of the interested parties are not required as documented information. In practice, however, it is recommended to summarize the related considerations in a document. The involvement of top management is very important for the success of an environmental management system. Top management must provide the necessary resources to implement and maintain the environmental management system. For this reason, ISO 14001 places some clear requirements on top management. The most important requirement for corporate management is that it demonstrates a commitment to the environmental management system. Specifically, it is required to do the following: to be responsible to owners, employees and other interested parties that the implemented environmental management system is effective. To establish an environmental policy that is consistent with the company's strategy and context. The policy should also provide a framework for specific environmental objectives. The integration of environmental management requirements into all processes of the company. Providing the necessary resources for environmental management. This includes both human and financial resources. Communicating the meaning and importance of environmental management in the company. Ensuring that the environmental management system achieves its intended goals, and helping employees contribute to those goals. Promoting continuous improvement of the environmental management system. Another requirement for management is to define the roles and responsibilities in the company with respect to environmental management. Usually, an environmental manager is appointed for this purpose. In Chapter 5, the standard requires only the environmental policy as documented information. But to prove the assignment of roles and responsibilities in the company, the auditor usually expects an organization chart and job descriptions.